The unexpected battlefield. The sky above Earth tore open with a flash of blinding light. A fireball shot through the clouds, trailing smoke as it hurtled toward the ground. People below barely noticed. Some thought it was just a shooting star. Others ignored it entirely. But this was no ordinary falling object. Inside that burning comet was Zura, a warrior from the distant galaxy of Vorten. She was the fiercest fighter of her race, trained to conquer planets and crush any enemy that dared stand in her way. Zura's mission was simple: invade Earth, eliminate resistance, and prepare the planet for her people's arrival. She had fought in countless battles, destroyed entire civilizations, and never tasted defeat. But today, everything was about to change. The fireball crashed into the ground with a deafening boom, but not into a battlefield, as Zura expected. Instead, she smashed through the roof of a small two-story house in a quiet neighborhood. The walls trembled, dust filled the air, and the floorboards groaned under the weight of her armor. Zura stood up, her glowing blade in hand, ready to face Earth's defenders. But there were no soldiers, no weapons, no alarms. She blinked through the dust, her sharp eyes adjusting to the dim light. She wasn't in a war zone. She was in a bedroom. The room was messy, filled with strange objects. Posters of colorful humans covered the walls, some holding musical instruments, others in heroic poses. A small screen flickered in the corner, showing moving images of people talking and laughing. There were clothes scattered on the floor, and a pile of books teetered dangerously on the edge of a desk. And then she saw him. A boy, no older than 16, lay in bed, his headphones still on, music blaring. His eyes fluttered open, and he stared at Zura. For a moment, neither of them moved. Zura expected him to scream, to run, to show fear like every other species she had conquered. But he didn't. Instead, he rubbed his eyes, pulled off his headphones, and said, "Are you cosplaying or something?" Zura's eyes narrowed. She didn't understand his words, but his tone confused her. Why wasn't he afraid? She raised her cosmic blade, its blue light humming through the air. The boy's eyes widened, not in fear, but in curiosity. "Whoa, that's a cool sword. Is it real?" Zura stepped closer, her heavy boots cracking the wooden floor. The boy finally sat up, but instead of running, he reached for something on his bedside table. Zura's warrior instincts kicked in. She was sure he was grabbing a weapon. She tensed, ready to strike before he could attack. But what he picked up wasn't a weapon. It was a small black rectangle with colorful buttons. He pointed it at her. Zura's heart pounded. Was this some advanced Earth technology? A hidden weapon? She prepared to dodge the attack. Click. Suddenly, the small screen in the corner of the room lit up, filling the room with bright light and loud voices. Zura flinched, swinging her blade at the noise, but nothing happened. The boy burst out laughing. "Chill, alien lady. It's just the TV remote." Zura froze. She didn't understand what just happened. This human had used a strange device to create sound and light. Was this some kind of psychological weapon? Was he trying to confuse her? The boy stood up, brushing crumbs off his shirt. "Man, you scared the crap out of me for a second. But that armor's sick. You going to a convention or something?" Zura didn't know what a convention was, but she knew one thing. This human wasn't afraid of her, and that scared her more than any weapon. She tried to activate her armor's translator to communicate, but something was wrong. The Earth's strange energy interfered with her technology. Static buzzed in her ear, and her blade flickered. She frowned. This had never happened before. Could Earth's environment be more dangerous than she thought? The boy noticed her confusion. "You okay? You look kinda lost." Zura didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mind raced, trying to understand this new threat. Her mission was clear: defeat the enemy. But what if the enemy didn't even know there was a war? She took a step back, her confidence shaken for the first time in her life. The boy watched her, his head tilted like he was studying a strange animal at the zoo. Then he smiled. "Hey, you hungry? I've got some snacks." Zura's eyes widened. Was this a trick? In all her battles, no enemy had ever offered her food. She tightened her grip on her blade, but the boy just shrugged and walked to his desk. He grabbed a shiny bag, tore it open, and pulled out a strange orange stick. "Cheeto," he offered, holding it out like a peace treaty. Zura stared at the glowing snack, unsure of what to do. Her armor sensors scanned it. It was harmless. But still, she didn't trust it. She raised her blade slightly, signaling she wouldn't be fooled by simple tricks. The boy laughed again. "Suit yourself." As he munched on the snack, Zura realized something terrifying. This wasn't a battlefield. And that meant she didn't know the rules of this fight. Before she could decide her next move, a loud noise erupted from the boy's desk. Zura spun around, blade raised, ready to strike. But it was just a small rectangular device glowing with light. The boy sighed and picked it up. "It's just my phone. Chill out." But Zura didn't chill. She realized something far worse than an enemy attack had happened. For the first time in her life, she was out of control. And the war had only just begun. The first encounter. The room was too quiet. Zura stood motionless, her glowing cosmic blade humming softly in the stillness of the boy's bedroom. The boy, Jake, as she'd overheard from the strange sounds coming from his glowing device, sat cross-legged on his bed, casually scrolling through his phone, as if an alien warrior hadn't just crashed through his ceiling. This wasn't right. Zura had conquered planets where entire armies trembled at the mere sight of her armor. She had fought beasts with fangs longer than her arm, and defeated warriors whose names echoed across galaxies. But this human, this boy, acted like she was nothing more than an odd guest at a sleepover. And that made her uneasy. Zura's mind raced. Her mission was clear: scout Earth, eliminate resistance, and report back to her commanders. But how could she eliminate a threat that didn't even recognize her as one? She tightened her grip on her blade. Maybe this was a trick. Maybe Earth's defenses were more psychological than physical. Could this boy be lulling her into a false sense of security? Her eyes narrowed. She wouldn't be fooled. Suddenly, Jake glanced up from his phone. "You're still here?" he asked, his voice full of amusement. "I thought you'd, fly away or something. Don't aliens have jetpacks?" Zura didn't understand his words, but his tone, that she understood. He wasn't scared, not even a little. Her pride burned hotter than any star in the Vorten system. No one disrespected Zura, warlord of the cosmic blades. She took a step forward, the floor creaking under the weight of her armored boots. Jake raised an eyebrow, but didn't move. "You're really committing to this, huh?" He chuckled, tossing his phone onto the bed. "All right, alien lady, let's see what you've got." In a blur of motion, Jake leaped off the bed and lunged at her. Zura's instincts kicked in. She slashed her blade through the air, expecting to slice through his weak human body. But Jake wasn't just any human. He ducked under her swing with surprising speed, rolling across the floor and grabbing something from under his bed. Zura spun, ready to strike again, but froze when she saw what he held. It wasn't a weapon. It was a hockey stick. Jake grinned, spinning the stick in his hands like a seasoned fighter. "Let's see how you handle this, space warrior." Zura blinked. She had battled plasma cannons, dodged energy blasts, and faced off against creatures with venomous claws. But never, not in all her years of training, had she been challenged by a human with a sports stick. For a moment, disbelief rooted her to the spot. But Jake didn't wait. With a shout, he charged. Zura barely had time to react. She parried his first strike, the stick clashing against her cosmic blade with a loud crack. The force of the blow surprised her. He was stronger than he looked. She countered with a swift kick, aiming for his chest, but Jake twisted away, the hockey stick spinning in a wide arc. They clashed again and again, the small bedroom turning into an unexpected battleground. Posters fluttered from the walls, books toppled from shelves, and the bed creaked dangerously as they fought. Jake moved with a strange, unpredictable rhythm, his movements a mix of street smarts and instinct. Zura, for all her alien training, found it hard to predict his next move. This wasn't a fight she'd prepared for. Her breathing grew heavier, frustration bubbling under her calm exterior. How was this possible? She was a warrior of the Vorten Empire, trained in 1,000 forms of combat. She should have defeated him in seconds, but Jake wasn't playing by the rules of galactic warfare. He fought like a human, and that made all the difference. Zura's blade hummed as she swung again, this time with all her strength. Jake barely managed to block the blow, the force sending him crashing into the dresser. The impact knocked the lamp to the floor, plunging the room into semi-darkness. For a brief moment, everything went still. Zura stood over him, her blade glowing ominously in the dim light. Jake groaned, rubbing the back of his head. He looked up at her, breathing hard, sweat trickling down his forehead. And then, he laughed. Zura blinked, stunned. No one laughed in the face of defeat, but Jake did. He sat there, grinning like this was the most fun he'd had in ages. "You're not bad," he panted, "for an alien." Zura's grip on her blade tightened, but something inside her shifted. This boy, this human, was unlike any enemy she'd faced. He wasn't fighting to win. He wasn't even fighting to survive. He was fighting because he enjoyed it. And for the first time in her life, Zura didn't know what to do next. Jake climbed to his feet, still chuckling. "You hungry yet? Or do we have to break more furniture before you calm down?" Zura stared at him, her mind racing. She could end this now. One swift strike, and the mission would be back on track. But something about this human intrigued her. His defiance wasn't born from arrogance or ignorance. It came from something deeper, something she couldn't quite understand. And that scared her more than any weapon. Before she could decide her next move, a loud buzzing noise filled the room. Both of them froze. Jake's eyes darted to his phone, which was vibrating wildly on the bed. "Hold up," he said, holding up a hand as if they were old friends pausing a game. He grabbed the phone and stared at the screen. His grin faded. Zura watched as the color drained from his face. Whatever message he'd received had shaken him. Jake looked up at her, his earlier bravado gone. You might want to stick around," he muttered. "I think we've got bigger problems." Zura's eyes narrowed. Bigger problems? What could be bigger than her? Jake handed her the phone. Zura didn't understand the symbols on the screen, but the images spoke for themselves. A massive, burning ship hovered over Earth's atmosphere. And it wasn't hers. Zura's blood ran cold. The invasion had already begun. The strange bond. The room was still, but the tension crackled like static in the air. Zura stood by the shattered window, her cosmic blade dimmed, her sharp eyes fixed on the night sky. The alien warship Jake had shown her was no ordinary vessel. It was Vorten, her people's elite battle cruiser. But why were they here so soon? She was supposed to scout Earth, report back, and only then would the fleet arrive. Something was wrong. Behind her, Jake shuffled around the room, gathering what little remained of his belongings after their chaotic battle. He stuffed clothes into a worn-out backpack and grabbed his phone charger because, apparently, in the middle of an alien invasion, humans still worried about their battery life. Zura couldn't understand this boy. When she had first crashed into his life, literally, she had expected fear, panic, maybe even awe. But Jake had faced her like she was just another challenge in a long list of weird things he'd dealt with. Now, even after seeing proof of an impending alien invasion, he wasn't screaming or running. He was packing. "What are you doing?" Zura's voice was rough, her translator still glitching from Earth's interference, but the message was clear enough. Jake didn't even flinch. "We need to get out of here," he said matter-of-factly, slinging the backpack over his shoulder. If those guys are your friends, I'm guessing they're not here to share cookies. Zura frowned. They are not friends. Jake paused at that. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since this all started. The glowing blade, the alien armor, the battle scars, none of it scared him. But the hint of fear in Zura's voice, that got his attention. They're here for you, aren't they? Zura didn't answer. She didn't need to. The flicker of uncertainty in her eyes said it all. Jake exhaled slowly, running a hand through his messy hair. Great, so I'm stuck with the alien who pissed off other aliens. Zura's eyes narrowed. You are free to leave. Jake gave her a lopsided grin. Nah, you broke my ceiling. Pretty sure you owe me. For a moment, Zura didn't know how to respond. No one had ever spoken to her like this. On Vorten, respect was earned through fear and strength. But Jake treated her like an equal. No, not even that. Like she was just some weird girl who crashed his party. It was unsettling and strangely comforting. They left the house quietly, slipping through the back door into the cool night air. The streets were eerily silent, the usual hum of human life replaced by an oppressive stillness. Zura could feel it, the tension in the air, like the calm before a cosmic storm. Jake led the way, his steps confident despite the situation. Zura followed, her senses on high alert. She could hear the distant hum of the Vorten warship, feel the faint vibrations under her feet. They were close, too close. As they moved through the deserted streets, Jake broke the silence. So, you're some kind of space warrior, right? Zura glanced at him but said nothing. Jake continued, undeterred. You're supposed to be all tough and unbeatable. But now you're running from your own people. Why? Zura's jaw tightened. She didn't owe him an explanation, but something about his casual bravery, his refusal to treat her like a monster, made her hesitate. They betrayed me, she finally admitted, her voice low. I was sent to scout this planet, but they came early. They want me dead. Jake whistled softly. Dang, that's rough. Zura frowned. It is not rough. It is treason. Jake chuckled. Same thing where I'm from. For a while, they walked in silence, the weight of their words hanging between them. Zura didn't understand this human. He was weak, untrained, and utterly unprepared for what was coming. Yet he faced it all with a kind of stubborn optimism that defied logic. And for reasons she couldn't explain, Zura found herself trusting him. They reached the edge of the city where the buildings gave way to open fields. Zura stopped, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, she could see the faint glow of the Vorten warship, hovering like a predator waiting to strike. Jake followed her gaze, his expression serious for once. So, what's the plan? We hide, fight, surrender, and hope they don't vaporize us. Zura's lips curled into a rare, bitter smile. I do not surrender. Jake snorted. Yeah, I figured. Zura took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had faced impossible odds before, but this was different. She was stranded on an unfamiliar planet. Her people wanted her dead, and her only ally was a sarcastic human boy with a hockey stick. It was absurd. And yet, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Jake nudged her with his elbow. Hey, we'll figure it out. You're not alone in this. Zura turned to him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. On Vorten, weakness was punished, and alliances were temporary. But here, on this strange planet, a human she had just met was offering her something she never expected. Friendship. It was a strange bond, but it might be the only thing that could save them. Just as Zura was about to respond, the ground trembled beneath their feet. A low, rumbling growl echoed through the night, growing louder with each passing second. Zura's heart pounded in her chest as she realized what it was. The Vorten had deployed hunters. Massive biomechanical creatures designed for one purpose: to track and eliminate rogue warriors. Jake's eyes widened as he saw them crest the hill, their glowing red eyes scanning the darkness. I'm guessing those aren't your friends either." Zura's grip tightened on her blade. "No, they are here for both of us now." Jake swallowed hard but managed to grin. "Well, I hope they like hockey." As the hunters charged toward them, Zura felt a strange surge of determination. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for Jake, for this strange new world that had shown her a different kind of strength. And together, they would face whatever the universe threw at them. The enemy approaches. The night was shattered by the deafening roar of engines as the Vorten hunters descended from the sky. Zura had faced many enemies in her life. Galactic warlords, bioengineered assassins, entire armies bred for destruction. But these hunters, they were something else. Designed with precision, fused with alien technology and biological terror, they were relentless trackers. Once locked onto their target, they never stopped. And now, they were after her. Beside her, Jake was frozen in place, staring wide-eyed at the towering figures closing in on them. Their metal bodies glinted under the moonlight, their glowing red eyes piercing through the darkness like twin beacons of death. Each step they took sent vibrations through the ground, like an ominous drumbeat of impending doom. Zura grabbed Jake by the arm, pulling him back behind an abandoned car. His heart was pounding so loud she could almost hear it, but he didn't resist. Not yet. What are those things?" Jake whispered, peeking over the rusted hood of the car. Zura's eyes stayed fixed on the advancing hunters. "They are death. They do not stop. They do not feel. And they will not leave until we are both dead." Jake let out a nervous laugh. "Well, that's comforting." Zura shot him a glance. His attempts at humor were strange to her, but they masked a bravery she hadn't expected. Most species would be paralyzed with fear in the face of Vorten hunters. But Jake, he was scared, sure, but he was still here, still fighting. And for some reason, that mattered. The hunters were closing in now, their mechanical limbs moving with terrifying grace. Zura could feel the vibrations through the soles of her boots, each step a reminder of how little time they had. "We can't fight them," Jake said, his voice tense. "Right? I mean, you've got that cool glowing sword, but I've seen enough movies to know this is the part where we run." Zura considered this. Her cosmic blade was powerful, but the hunters were designed to counter Vorten weapons. They would adapt quickly, learn her fighting style, and overwhelm her with brute force. She could maybe take one down. Maybe. But two? No chance. "We need to move," she said, her voice steady. "Now." They darted from behind the car, sprinting across the open field toward a dense forest in the distance. Zura's armor made her faster, but she slowed her pace to match Jake's. His breathing was ragged, his steps uneven, but he didn't complain. He just kept running. Behind them, the hunters roared in frustration, their heavy footsteps pounding against the earth as they gave chase. Trees whipped past them as they plunged into the forest, the branches scratching against Zura's armor and Jake's exposed skin. The darkness provided some cover, but the hunters wouldn't be fooled for long. Zura could feel their presence closing in, like shadows creeping at the edges of her vision. They stumbled into a small clearing, the moonlight filtering through the trees in eerie shafts. Jake collapsed against a fallen log, gasping for breath. Zura scanned the area, her mind racing for a plan. "We can't keep running," Jake panted. "They'll catch us eventually." Zura nodded. She knew he was right. The hunters were faster, stronger, and tireless. But there was one thing they weren't. They weren't human. Zura turned to Jake, an idea forming in her mind. "Your world, it is unpredictable. Dangerous in ways my people do not understand." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, Earth's a mess. What's your point?" She knelt beside him, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "We can use that." They didn't have long. Zura worked quickly, using the environment to set traps. She had never fought alongside a human before, but Jake's resourcefulness surprised her. He showed her how to use the strange earth materials: gasoline from an abandoned car, sharp metal scraps from a rusted fence, even fireworks from a forgotten backyard stash. Together, they created a battlefield. As they finished setting the last trap, Jake wiped sweat from his forehead and looked at her. "You sure this'll work?" Zura met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "No," Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, at least you're honest." Before Zura could respond, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The hunters had found them. The first hunter burst into the clearing, its massive frame crashing through the trees like a wrecking ball. Its glowing red eyes locked onto Zura, and it let out a deafening mechanical roar. The second hunter wasn't far behind, flanking them with deadly precision. Zura stood her ground, her blade humming with energy. Jake crouched behind a fallen tree, his makeshift detonator in hand. The hunters charge. At the last possible second, Zura dove to the side, rolling across the ground as the first hunter triggered the gasoline trap. Jake hit the detonator, and the clearing exploded in a fireball of light and sound. The hunters shrieked, their metal bodies engulfed in flames. But it wasn't enough. One of the hunters emerged from the fire, its armor charred but still functional. It charged at Jake, its claws extended. Zura's heart pounded as she sprinted toward him, her blade slicing through the air. She intercepted the hunter just as it reached Jake, driving her blade into its core. Sparks flew, and the hunter let out a final screeching wail before collapsing in a heap of smoking metal. But the second hunter was still coming. Zura barely had time to react as it lunged at her, knocking her to the ground. Its claws raked across her armor, sending sparks flying. She struggled beneath its weight, her strength fading. And then, out of nowhere, Jake appeared. With a defiant yell, he swung his hockey stick at the hunter's exposed wiring, jamming it into the creature's neck. The hunter convulsed, its systems short-circuiting. Zura seized the opportunity, driving her blade into its head with all her remaining strength. The hunter collapsed, twitching violently before falling still. For a moment, there was only silence. Zura lay on the ground, breathing heavily, her body aching from the fight. Beside her, Jake collapsed into the grass, his chest rising and falling with each ragged breath. They had done it. Against all odds, they had won. Zura turned her head to look at Jake. His face was dirty, his clothes torn, but there was a triumphant grin on his face. "You're not bad," he panted, "for an alien." Zura couldn't help but smile. Maybe Earth wasn't so weak after all. But as she looked up at the night sky, her smile faded. The Vorten warship still hovered above them, and Zura knew this was far from over. The real battle was just beginning. The battle begins. The dawn crept over the horizon, casting an eerie golden light on the forest clearing that had become their makeshift battlefield. The remains of the Vorten hunters lay scattered, twisted metal, sparking wires, and scorch marks on the ground like scars from the violent struggle. The air still smelled of smoke and ozone, a lingering reminder that they had survived. But Zura knew better. This wasn't victory. This was just a pause before the storm. High above, the Vorten warship loomed like a silent predator, its shadow stretching across the land, as if claiming Earth itself. Zura could feel the pulse of its engines vibrating through the atmosphere, a low hum that rattled her bones. She recognized that sound. It meant the warship was preparing for something big, a full-scale assault. Beside her, Jake stirred, groaning as he sat up against the charred remains of a fallen tree. His face was pale, dark circles under his eyes from exhaustion, but the defiant spark in his gaze hadn't dimmed. "So," he muttered, rubbing his shoulder where the hunter's claw had grazed him, "I'm guessing we don't get a coffee break after that." Zura didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the warship, calculating, planning. She had faced countless battles, But this situation was unlike anything she'd encountered. She was stranded, her own people hunting her, and her only ally was a stubborn human boy with more courage than sense. But as impossible as it seemed, she wasn't ready to give up. And neither was Jake. They had only a few hours before the assault began. Zura explained the situation as best she could, how the Vorten warship would deploy an exterminator unit, an elite squad designed to eliminate all resistance swiftly and brutally. Earth's military wouldn't stand a chance against their advanced technology. But Earth had something the Vorten didn't: unpredictability. Jake listened, his mind racing as he processed the enormity of their situation. So, what, you're saying it's just us against an entire alien death squad? No pressure or anything? Zura nodded, her expression serious. We fight, or we die. Jake blew out a long breath, then gave her a crooked grin. Well, when you put it like that. They moved quickly, gathering supplies from nearby abandoned houses and junkyards. Jake showed Zura how to create makeshift explosives using Earth's crude materials: propane tanks, fireworks, even car batteries. Zura, in turn, modified these with her alien tech, enhancing their destructive power beyond anything Jake had ever imagined. By the time the sun was high in the sky, they had turned the small town into a labyrinth of traps and defenses. But deep down, they both knew it wouldn't be enough. As evening approached, the first signs of the Vorten assault appeared. The ground trembled as sleek, black dropships descended from the sky, their hulls gleaming like liquid obsidian. The townspeople, unaware of the impending doom, began to emerge from their homes, staring in confusion and fear at the strange objects hovering above their streets. Jake's heart clenched. He had grown up in this town. These were his neighbors, his friends. He couldn't let them be slaughtered. We need to warn them, he said, turning to Zura. Zura shook her head. There is no time. They will not believe. They will only slow us down. Jake clenched his fists. I'm not leaving them. For a moment, Zura's expression softened. She saw something in Jake's determination that resonated with her. On Vorten, the strong survived by any means necessary, even if it meant abandoning the weak. But here, on Earth, Jake's refusal to leave his people behind wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. With a reluctant nod, Zura followed Jake into the town square, where a small crowd had gathered. The people stared at them, wide-eyed and confused. To them, Jake was just the local troublemaker, and Zura, an armored alien warrior, looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. But Jake didn't care. Listen up, he shouted, his voice cutting through the murmurs. I know this sounds crazy, but we're under attack. Real attack. Like alien death squad level attack. And if you want to live, you need to listen to me. The crowd erupted in disbelief and laughter. Some people pulled out their phones, recording what they thought was a prank or a publicity stunt. But then, the first dropship landed in the center of the square, its doors hissing open with a sinister clang. Out stepped the exterminators. They were taller than any human, their sleek black armor gleaming under the fading sunlight. Their faces were hidden behind reflective visors, and they moved with a terrifying precision, like machines programmed solely for destruction. The crowd's laughter died instantly. Panic set in. People screamed and scattered as the exterminators opened fire, their plasma rifles cutting through buildings and vehicles like paper. The town erupted into chaos, but Jake and Zura stood their ground. The battle had begun. Zura moved like a blur, her cosmic blade slicing through exterminators with surgical precision. But for every one she destroyed, two more took its place. Jake darted through the chaos, leading civilians to safety, using his homemade traps to slow the enemy's advance. A propane tank exploded behind him, sending a wave of heat and debris into the air. Jake barely had time to dive behind a car as plasma bolts rained down around him. Zura, he shouted, spotting her surrounded by a group of exterminators near the town hall. She fought valiantly, but even she was beginning to falter under the relentless assault. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't let her die, not after everything they'd been through. With a burst of adrenaline, he sprinted toward her, dodging debris and enemy fire. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the last of their makeshift explosives, a car battery rigged with alien tech. "Zura, duck," he yelled. Without hesitation, Zura dropped to the ground as Jake hurled the device into the center of the exterminators. It detonated with a blinding flash, sending a shockwave through the square. The exterminators were thrown back, their armor cracking under the force of the explosion. For a brief, glorious moment, the town was silent. Then, the warship above them moved. A massive beam of light shot down from its underbelly, incinerating everything in its path. The ground trembled violently as buildings collapsed, and the earth split apart. Zura grabbed Jake's arm, dragging him into the shelter of a crumbling building. "We cannot win like this," she shouted over the roar. Jake's chest heaved as he caught his breath. "Then what do we do?" Zura's eyes glowed with fierce determination. "We take the fight to them." Jake stared at her, realizing what she meant. "You're talking about getting on that ship." Zura nodded. "It is the only way." Jake swallowed hard, feeling the weight of what she was saying. But then he looked around. The town in ruins, the people terrified but still alive because of them. He met Zura's gaze and nodded. "All right, space warrior, let's go kick some alien ass." And with that, they sprinted toward the warship, ready to face the impossible. Because this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was a fight for Earth, the ultimate sacrifice. The warship loomed above them like a floating fortress of death, its black hull pulsing with an ominous red glow. Zura and Jake stood at the edge of the smoldering town, their hearts pounding in sync with the distant hum of the ship's engines. The destruction below was complete, houses reduced to rubble, streets torn apart, and the sky thick with smoke. But against all odds, they were still standing. Zura's gaze hardened as she studied the warship. This wasn't just an enemy vessel, it was a symbol of everything she had once believed in. The Vorten Empire had been her life, her purpose, but now it was the very force trying to erase her from existence. She tightened her grip on her cosmic blade, feeling its familiar hum against her palm. Beside her, Jake adjusted the straps on his battered backpack, which now contained the last of their improvised explosives. His face was smeared with dirt and sweat, his clothes torn from the battle, but his eyes still burned with determination. "So," he began, breaking the heavy silence, "how exactly do we get onto a giant alien death ship? Do they have, like, a guest entrance?" Zura allowed herself a small, fleeting smile. Jake's humor was absurd, especially in the face of certain death, but somehow it kept her grounded. She shook her head. "There's an entry point," she said, pointing to a glowing hatch near the warship's underbelly, "but it's heavily guarded. We'll need a distraction." Jake followed her gaze and immediately frowned. "Let me guess. I'm the distraction." Zura's smile faded. "No, I am." They moved quickly through the ruins, staying low and avoiding the patrols of exterminators that still roamed the streets. The warship's beam had done most of the work, but the Vorten wanted to ensure no survivors. As they approached the ship, Zura turned to Jake, her expression unreadable. "When we get inside," she began, "you'll head to the core and plant the explosives. I'll draw their attention away from you." Jake's eyes narrowed. "Wait, what about you?" Zura hesitated. She had faced death more times than she could count, but this was different. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for him, for Earth, for a future she never thought she'd care about. "I'll hold them off," she finally said, "long enough for you to finish the mission." Jake shook his head, his jaw set. "No way. We do this together, Zura. We've come this far. I'm not leaving you behind." Zura's heart ached in a way she didn't understand. She had been trained to be a weapon, to suppress emotions and focus solely on the mission. But Jake, he made her feel things she wasn't prepared for. "Jake," she started, but he cut her off. "I'm serious," he said firmly. "We're a team. You saved me back there, and now it's my turn." For a moment, they just stood there, staring at each other amidst the chaos. Then, without another word, Zura reached out and placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "All right," she whispered. "Together." They launched their plan at dusk, using the shadows to their advantage. Zura took the lead, her blade slicing through exterminators with lethal precision. Jake followed close behind, using his knowledge of the town's layout to navigate through the wreckage and avoid enemy patrols. As they reached the warship's hatch, Zura hacked into the Vorten system using a small device from her armor. The hatch hissed open, revealing a dark corridor that pulsed with eerie red light. They slipped inside. The hatch ceiling shut behind them. The interior of the warship was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. The walls were made of a strange organic metal that seemed to breathe, and the air was thick with a metallic tang. The lights flickered rhythmically, casting long shadows that danced across the floor. Zura moved confidently, guiding Jake through the labyrinthine corridors toward the ship's core. But as they got closer, they encountered heavier resistance. Exterminators emerged from hidden alcoves, their plasma rifles blazing. Zura fought like a demon, her blade a blur of light and motion. But even she was beginning to tire. Jake did his best to help, using his explosives to take out groups of enemies, but the odds were stacked against them. Finally, they reached the core, a massive, pulsating sphere of energy suspended in the center of a vast chamber. The air crackled with raw power, and the heat was almost unbearable. Jake pulled out the explosives from his backpack and began setting them around the core, his hands trembling slightly. "Zura," he called out, glancing over his shoulder. "How much time do we need?" Zura scanned the room, her eyes narrowing as she spotted a group of Vorten soldiers approaching from the far side of the chamber. "Not much," she said grimly, "but we need to move now." Just as Jake finished setting the last charge, an alarm blared throughout the ship. The lights turned blood red, and a voice echoed through the chambers in the harsh Vorten language. Zura's heart sank as she translated the words in her head. "Intruders detected. Elimination protocol engaged." The soldiers advanced, their weapons trained on Jake. Without thinking, Zura threw herself in front of him, deflecting the plasma bolts with her blade. But there were too many. She couldn't hold them off forever. Jake grabbed her arm, his eyes wide with fear. "Zura, we have to go." But Zura knew the truth. They wouldn't make it out together. The soldiers were closing in, and the countdown on the explosives was ticking down fast. She turned to Jake, her expression softening. "You need to go." Jake shook his head violently. "No, I'm not leaving you." Zura placed a hand on his cheek, something warm and unfamiliar blooming in her chest. "You have to. This world needs you." Jake's eyes filled with tears. "Zura, please." But there was no time. With a sudden burst of strength, Zura shoved Jake toward the exit, sealing the door behind him with a quick slash of her blade. Jake pounded on the door, screaming her name, but Zura didn't waver. She turned to face the oncoming soldiers, her blade glowing brighter than ever. If this was the end, she would face it like a warrior. As the countdown reached its final seconds, Zura took a deep breath, thinking of the strange human who had changed everything. And for the first time in her life, she felt at peace. The warship exploded in a blinding flash of light, a shockwave tearing through the sky and sending debris raining down on the town below. Jake watched from a distance, his heart breaking as the ship disintegrated. He fell to his knees, the weight of Zura's sacrifice crushing him. But even in his grief, he knew one thing. Zura hadn't just saved him. She had saved Earth, and her story was far from over. A new beginning. The sky over Earth was eerily quiet. Where once the monstrous Vorten warship had loomed, casting its dark shadow over the town, There was now only smoke, scattered debris, and the faint glow of fires smoldering in the distance. The alien invaders were gone, their technology reduced to twisted metal and ash. But victory had come at a cost. Jake sat on the edge of the town's crumbled main square, staring at the horizon, where the explosion had torn through the sky just hours earlier. His body ached from the battle. His skin was marked with cuts and bruises, but it was the emptiness in his chest that hurt the most. Zura was gone. The thought echoed in his mind, over and over. He could still see her standing there in the ship's core, her glowing eyes meeting his for the last time, her voice calm even as the world collapsed around them. "You have to go." He had begged her to come with him. But Zura was a warrior. She knew the fight couldn't be won by both of them surviving. She had made her choice, and now Jake was left to pick up the pieces. For days, Jake wandered the ruins of his hometown. The survivors, the few who had managed to escape the exterminator's wrath, looked to him with a strange mix of fear and respect. To them, he was the boy who had fought back, the human who had somehow helped destroy an alien invasion. But Jake didn't feel like a hero. He felt hollow. Every corner of the town reminded him of her. The forest clearing where they'd made their first stand, the rooftops where they'd set traps, even his own shattered bedroom ceiling where this insane journey had begun. He replayed every moment in his mind, clinging to the memories because they were all he had left. But deep down, he couldn't shake a feeling. This wasn't over. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jake sat alone on the rooftop of what was left of his high school. The town below was beginning to stir again. People were rebuilding, trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy after the chaos. But Jake felt like he didn't belong. Not anymore. He was staring at the stars, wondering if Zura's people would come back, when a strange sound cut through the quiet night. It was faint at first, like a whisper in the wind, but it grew louder. An electronic hum, familiar and foreign all at once. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He scrambled to his feet, scanning the darkened sky. For a moment, he thought it might be another ship, maybe a second wave of Vorten forces. But as the sound grew clearer, he realized it wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from beneath him. Jake sprinted down the crumbling stairwell, his heart pounding in his chest. He followed the sound through the school's ruined hallways, past lockers blown apart by the initial invasion, until he reached the basement. There, hidden beneath rubble and dust, was a faint, glowing light. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he pushed aside the debris. It was a piece of alien tech, small, sleek, and pulsing with that same blue energy he had come to recognize as hers. His hands trembled as he picked it up. The device was warm to the touch, almost like it was alive. And then it activated. A holographic projection flickered to life above the device, and Jake stumbled back, his eyes widening. It was Zura. Her image was faint, translucent, but unmistakably her. She looked just as she had the last time he saw her. Fierce, proud, but with that same softness in her eyes that she only ever showed him. "Jake," her voice echoed through the basement, and it felt like a punch to the chest. "If you're seeing this, it means I didn't make it." Jake clenched his fists, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. "I knew the risks," Zura continued, her expression serious. "But I also knew you. You're stronger than you think. And Earth is worth fighting for." The hologram flickered, but her voice remained steady. "There's something you need to know. The Vorten, they won't stop. This was just the beginning. They'll come back, and they'll bring forces far greater than what you faced here." Jake's heart pounded. The thought of another invasion made his blood run cold. "But you won't be alone," Zura's image said, and for the first time, her lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "I left something behind." Jake frowned, confused. "What do you mean, left something behind?" As if in response, the device in his hands pulsed brighter. Suddenly, it began to unfold, shifting and expanding in a way that defied physics. Jake stumbled back as the light grew blinding, and then she was there. Not just a hologram. Her. Zura stood in front of him, her form solid and real, though different. Her armor was scorched and battered, and there was a faint, shimmering glow around her, like she was both there and not there at the same time. "Zura," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. She smiled, really smiled this time, and nodded. "I'm not entirely what I was. The explosion destroyed my body, but part of me survived. My consciousness was integrated into the Vorten tech during the blast. I'm something new now." Jake's knees felt weak, and he sank to the floor, staring up at her in disbelief. "You're alive," he managed, his throat tight. Zura nodded, kneeling in front of him. "In a way, I'm connected to the Vorten systems, to their network. I know their plans, their weaknesses, and with your help, we can stop them." Jake laughed, a breathless, disbelieving sound, as tears finally spilled down his cheeks. "I thought I lost you." Zura reached out, her hand warm against his cheek. "You can't get rid of me that easily, human." From that day on, they were inseparable. Zura's new form allowed her to interact with both human and alien technology, giving Earth a fighting chance against future invasions. And Jake became something more than just a small-town boy. With Zura by his side, he trained, learned, and prepared for the battles to come. Together, they formed a resistance, humans and alien allies alike, ready to face whatever the Vorten Empire threw at them. Because this wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. This was a fight for the future. And as long as they were together, Jake and Zura knew they could face anything.